Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. Thanks for tuning in to this month's article where I'm going to teach you how to edit color for specific seasons. So, shooting outside in winter, specifically in the Midwest where there aren't any mountains, here in Illinois, we have a lot of issues with color and lack of color and landscape. So, what I like to do in photographing this time of year is, typically we'll go to like a Christmas tree farm or somewhere where there's that green kind of pine color that stays where everything else gets kind of desaturated. But I want to kind of use that kind of look and that theme, but create a kind of sunlit image. So a lot of times, especially during shoots where it's way too cold to be setting up lighting, having clients out for more than 5 to 10 minutes at a time without going back into the car to thaw. You have to be a little more creative in post production, which is what I want to show you how to do that in Lightroom and how to do that quite quickly. So what I was able to do in Lightroom is create some sunlight, create some sun flare, but not something to the point of to where it looks um, too overdone, but with creative things, right? Everyone has tastes and opinions and what works for them. So for these kind of images, I kind of started with an underexposed, kind of a warmer shot image which is kind of what the Sony gives me, with this kind of shot. But I can take that image and kind of add some flare to it, right? No pun intended, but adding some sun flare with a close-up image like this, where I'm kind of guiding the image around these open areas. Kind of how I shot this, kind of putting the client or weighing the client down to the bottom left and opening up the space at the top and side. This is a shot of my wife and son as we were doing some Christmas photos, as well as my son running through some kind of pine trees here, or whatever type of trees these are. So I can get kind of an image like this, which is shot a little bit darker, overcast sky, pretty boring up here. And instead of having to crop all of that out, like I had in my close-up shot, whereas right, I have the greenery and foliage kind of filling that dead space in back there. Now I kind of have the image opens up and escapes here, but I can add some sun flare so it brings us back down to him, where all of these kind of darker black tones and a lot more density in the image. So let's jump into the basic panel and talk about color correction for a neutral base to get this image started. All right, so first things first, we have to cover our basics with basic color correction. So my goal is to get a more neutral base for this image. So in here, I'm not doing anything too crazy, right? White balance, exposure, highlights, and shadows. That's kind of where I hang my hat on for um, basic editing of color and brightness. What I like to do is to go down to the tone curve, and I want to give this image a little more of kind of a film push. And I have a bunch of pre-built point curves here, and a bunch of different sort of film styles. So as you can see, a few of these that just kind of take the image and they start messing with the RGB channels to really start to alter this image with quick clicks, right? So you have all these different options in here that are from different film presets and things like that. So we got Velvia in here to really kind of push some of that more slide film look. But if I start with like an E200, you see how dark this image gets and things like that. So as soon as I apply something like a tone curve, I'm going to want to go back into my basic panel and start messing with these whites and blacks, right? So if I hold shift and double click on black, it's going to automatically shift to where the blacks aren't clipping too much, right? So if I double click there, it opens that up a bit. I can turn on my clipping mask. I don't really care too much about this area here, but I can really start to shift um, the blacks over to open this image up just a little bit, as well as the white point, adding just a little bit to brighten this image up. Now I think we're going a little too heavy in these tones overall, but you can get the picture for adjusting for basics panel. So things like tone curve or something I like to use for contrast. Then I would go down into my details panel, add any sharpening or luminance if I need to. Of course, we're shooting at ISO 100, so I don't have a whole lot going on here. This image is getting quite orange, which we'll cover with HSL in just a moment. But making sure we turn on the Lens correction, I kind of like the darkness that's going on around here. So we can turn on the lens correction to fix that, and we can actually turn off the vignetting, which is a pretty cool trick, right? It becomes custom, so you can't really do it and sync it to multiple images unless you're using the exact same lens. Of course, if you're using multiple lenses, you'll have to do that manually per lens, but that's a cool little effect here that you can do to keep your vignette, but just fix the distortion, right? Another thing you can do as well is come back in for post crop vignetting. That's what this is for when you start doing some crop work, to bring that back in, and you have a little more options to go there. Moving on, let's go back. I'm going to leave that at a darker vignette here. With our details panel, transform effects, calibration, all that kind of stuff is left as is. And this is kind of our basic toned image. Say lift those shadows just a little bit, maybe come down on the highlights. I kind of want to dull some of the highlights just a bit and kind of land at an image a little bit less warm. Something close to that, right? Just kind of bright and punchy. Now we're ready to move into the HSL panel and do some creative tone, split toning to create some effects with color as well. All right, now that you can see in my HSL panel, I already have some adjustments applied from a preset. So whether you're doing these from scratch or you are applying a purchased preset or one you've made to kind of shift the colors of the image, you can see how it shifts it from kind of a more natural, punchy, saturated look to this kind of more stylized appeal. How you can start to manipulate these type of things quite quickly is clicking on the target adjustment tool. So what I like to do is, in using that tool, I can click on the greens, click and scroll up to increase saturation, or scroll down to decrease. And as you see my sliders, the yellow and greens, it's automatically choosing tones from those areas. So I can really start to manipulate those. Same way with the skin tones, right? Like, so if I want to desaturate or bring the saturation back for the skin tones, I can do that, as well as the luminance. Hop down here, I can brighten or darken those tones of the face. And that kind of works for some quick, subtle dodging and burning if you want to brighten, skin tones and things like that. You can also darken or remove casts from certain, parts of the clothing. So if you think there's too much blue and, some neutral tones, you can remove that. But you have to keep in mind it's removing the blues in the entire image. So it's just something you want to keep at a more subtle base for, and not go a little too over the top. But you can see from where we start in our image from our color correction, and adding a little more of a desaturated kind of cooler toned look. Now taking that back, what I like to do is bring back in some warmth to the highlights and cool down those shadows even more. So the way I'm able to do that is by using the split toning panel. What I'll do is I'll choose in the highlights a tone between red and yellow, just kind of in this orange range. And as you see, the lower we go, there's this S moving, or saturation. That's going to be kind of like our amount tool. And as you can see, as you go higher, it really starts to um, increase that effect. But you can add a subtle amount of warmth to the highlights, and we can do the same thing for shadows, except we want to do a more cooler tone for the shadows between blue and purple, and cooling some of those areas down. So this is something that we can add in as another effect here. We can just turn this on and off just to kind of see our subtle change here. So again, these panels become a little more useful for you when you want to kind of push a more creative edit, and that's when it becomes really important to create versions or copies, right? So if I want to create a virtual copy, I'll hold Command or Control, hit the apostrophe key, and it automatically creates a copy for me. So I can toggle between my different versions, and I can have multiple versions of that same edit. So if I go down here to my copy 6 and 7, I can turn this up and just kind of toggling between those. Or if I want to turn it off completely, I can, of course, right? So what I want to do is create a split toned image like this and then add some sun flare in so that way we can start to paint in some effects. Or if we want to reset these panels, we can do that and have a more natural look overall. So now we're ready to look at local adjustments to start painting in and creating our own color tones and sunlight in this image. All right, now that we have our image color corrected and some creative color toning with HSL and split toning, we can go into our adjustment brush to start adding in some flare, right? Or if we want to do, some simple dodge and burn, with exposure, highlights, and shadows, that's kind of a more basic level or sort of a go-to for local adjustments. But now I want to add color and start to manipulate some of that background. So if I hit the K key, it'll take me right into the adjustment panel. And you'll notice at the very top that I have an effect called Sunflare 1. So I've already created a preset with my settings to automatically apply, right? Because I want to remove the contrast, I want to shift the highlights super bright, darken the shadows, and it kind of creates this, well, it's going to create this kind of warming, brighter tone to kind of bleach out these backgrounds. So it's kind of a little more counterintuitive to typical dodging and burning. Usually you burn down the background, brighten the subject. So what I like to do is start with, and this is kind of a more middle ground effect. For something close up like this, I'd probably want to go more subtle, but I'm just going to start painting in here. You'll notice as well as my settings here for feather and flow are both at 100. This means when I click and apply this, it's going to go at 100%. If I want to build this up, and I'll show you how this works, we can put flow at 30 and we can click and drag, and as you can see that effect starts to follow my brush. But if I keep holding the button and I keep circulating my brush here, it's gonna brighten those areas. So it kind of gives you a little more of an option to build up in Lightroom. So just a quick tip on how flow works. And if I leave it there, right, it's not really doing anything. But if I move my brush and I haven't clicked, haven't made any noises, I'm just continuing to build that up. If you move your brush around, it's gonna apply that effect and keep going. So what I like about that is once we're done, we can still tone it back with our sliders, right? So just something on how flow works as a tool. Density is kind of nice if you've created, if you want to put the flow to 100, but you want to take this entire effect and you want to go 50% with it, right? That's what density is going to be for. Because if we apply our setting, as you can see, it does one big jump. I'm circling, it's not doing anything. So that's the biggest difference between, from a simple perspective, of flow and density. If I change the density slider after that, it doesn't do anything, right? So it's a sort of a one-time use tool. Exposure, you can adjust, right? So those are some, I'm going to turn off my clipping. Those are just how these kind of tools work down here. So I'd keep density at 100. I think that that's fine. I do like to use flow at 30 to build up in an effect like this. But that's basically all that I'm doing to create flare. I'm going to use this area here. I'm going to kind of paint all of this in because all of the sunlight needs to hit those areas. There's not going to be any unnatural vignetting happening. I'm going to give them all a sort of, you know, an even touch over all of them. Then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to brighten these tones a little bit further because I want the sun flare coming in from the right side of the image. I'm going to have some of this pouring onto them to create a little blown out areas as well as having it peek onto the hat here. So that's just a quick way to apply this kind of bright toning. Now, as I want to go in and erase it from them, I can set my flow back to 34. I can hold my Option or Alt key and I can erase it from the face. So I want to make sure as I'm holding this Alt key and the entire time, I can erase it from the face to where it's a little too blown out. Also on the shoulder, I want to come back a little bit on that. I think it's a little too heavy. I can erase some of that flare out. So real quick ways to apply these effects to your images, but also have control of that sunlight. So you want to make sure, in the entire image, we're adding a little bit of a flare to where things make a little more sense. But we can add it in other areas a little bit more, so that way that effect looks a little more natural. So this is just a quick way on a close-up portrait. I probably wouldn't go this extreme, but you can see that how you can still apply a cool sun effect to an image like this and not have it too damaging. So this is where we were with our split tone image, which is a lot more dark and dramatic and moody, and we kind of brought some sunlight back into it quite quickly. Not something we could just do with the temperature and tint slider and the basic panel, or with other tools. You know, it's going to brighten the entire image with those. We can be a lot more selective. You know, with this tool, if I want to completely remove it from Graham's face, I can just take the flow back to 100. Excuse me, that's not going to do it. That's going to be on my standard brush. I have to hold Option and move the flow back to 100, and it will remove it 100% from his face, as you can see, as well as from Jess's face. I think that looks a little fake. That's why I like to, when I erase it, I like to keep my flow down closer to 30, just so I can remove it, sort of build down, if you will, from removing some of my effect. So that's just a quick way to do it on like a close-up portrait, which starts to look pretty cool. What I would like to do on a wider shot, you know, to get an effect in an image like this, is building an actual sun flare to apply and have it start to peer into this area and paint in here, right? So I can have effect more like this, which kind of actually gives me a sun flare. It starts to, you know, gets me out of, you know, getting lost in this dead space, and weighs the image, you know, keeps our eye down here where all the density is. So the way that I would attack an image like this is I would go again into the adjustment brush, and I have a sun flare and a sun flare scene. So for the sun flare, if I wanted to make this super extreme right out the gate, I'd probably put this at 4, and I'd make my brush a little bit smaller just to find where I want the sun to come in from, right? So if I want to probably put the flow to 100. And this is where I'm going to have, right? So it's almost creating a kind of fake sun flare right there. So that's our end goal, is to get something a little more blown out like that. What I like to start with is going in with a little more subtlety, and you definitely want to build up all of your edges first with the brightness, and then go over top with the sun flare, versus trying to work where the sun is and then adding in where all the spill light is. That becomes a little more difficult. Let me show you exactly what I mean. So if I go back to a little more subtle look, and I'm going to put the flow back to 30, and I'm going to make sure auto mask is off. I don't need auto mask on. Turn off that effect. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to paint all of the edges of these trees, right? So I want the edges of these trees painted. Make sure that those are all, just to kind of start lining this up for myself. So I want all of this area here is going to be the spill light for the sun flare, and I want to just kind of, as you can see, we're already kind of getting that spill light there without the sun flare coming in. Now it's going to be really difficult to get. We're not going to put a sun out here, right? That's not the end goal that we had here, but it's building this effect up, and as we go further down, it's going to really start to warm and eat into our image. Now remember, this is kind of the first setting, is what you want to do is start to get the edges of these trees where the most intense light is. Then we can go in with a more subtle brush. As you see what I did right there, we have to create a new brush, so to leave that effect. And now we're going to go in and paint our scene. And the scene needs to have that same kind of warmth, but it doesn't need to have the intense amount of warmth that the sun flare portion of the image needs to have. So it's kind of two-step, right? You need to create the sun flare, and then you need to create a preset for your scene. Or you can toggle the same preset and adjust the exposure. That's really all I did. But as we start to apply this, it's a very subtle amount on him. We can increase the exposure increase the warmth if we want to really warm this scene even up further. I don't want to do that. I don't think that looks very good. Then we can go back to our other pen and our adjustment. And since we have the flow, we can go in and make any final tweaks to kind of what's going on here. Now, again, if we get a little too heavy-handed and we want to paint off some of this tree to make it look a little more realistic, we want to make sure the sun flare is coming in from these edges, but you can see we can start to bleach um, some of these areas of the image and kind of create more guiding lines, or use the light to paint in to bring our focus down to him. So again, if you want to be a little more precise and focus on specific colors in the image, you can definitely use the range mask for color, which would help. I like to go a little more natural route with the just using the brushes and painting this in. And then if we need to kind of come down on our effect, we can easily do that with the exposure, right? Density is not going to do that for us. Density is not going to give us anything other than like a new brush stroke. You have the flow, which I like to use at a lower base. That definitely helps with the image. But you can kind of see the difference between the two of these. And in my original shot, or my original edit, I definitely went a little more subtle. And we can toggle the O key to show where those effects are going. But something like this, building kind of in the valley of these trees here and bleaching them out, certainly helps as we can dial this back. But that's just a real quick way to kind of get both of these images from a state of, before and after, right? Here's my before and after with the sun flare, keeping some of those elements. So I like shooting in this overcast because it allows me to control more of this image. In the same way here, and just kind of bringing back some of that flare. So just some quick things you can do in Lightroom. All right, so there you have it. When it comes down to editing color, it doesn't have to be this heavy-handed, right? It's a creative edit, it's stylized, it's something for, something my wife and I would put up in our house. It's kind of more for us. That's the beauty of being a creative, right? We all have our different tastes and opinions. We want to make sure things look good to us, but they don't look too fake or overdone. So you want to make sure technique-wise, you're being a little more subtle with the brushes. If you want to be a perfectionist and maybe do something like a larger wall portrait or blow something up, I definitely would recommend Photoshop, of course. But Lightroom is a really quick way to get some effects, some images, maybe posted on the blog online and take a look at. But there's definitely a lot of powerful tools in Lightroom, as you can see, to kind of mimic some of that heavy lifting that Photoshop does. There's plugins and things like that for sunlight flares to make things a little bit faster in Photoshop. So if you're looking for efficiency and that a little bit better of enlargement quality, I probably would stick with Photoshop as a whole. But branching out and trying something new, learning new techniques, that's what we're here to do, right? You want to learn something new and then decide, is that the tool for me? How can I tweak it for me? Or go, well, that's not a technique for me, but now I kind of better understand how to use these local adjustment tools and the power of an adjustment brush in Lightroom. But for me, when it's creating light in camera versus in post production, right? There's multiple ways to do it. I mean, if the lighting's ideal, of course, I'd rather shoot it in camera. It's much less work for me. When I'm on the go, so that way editing is much faster. And I'm better controlling of light, and just learning and being better in camera, of course, is where I want to be. But when it's winter, it's overcast. I don't want to wait for that perfect weather. I know how to create it in Lightroom and kind of create that perfect scene. So it's kind of the best of both worlds when I don't want to have to wait or count on perfect lighting mixed with perfect temperature, right? It was like 15 degrees outside that day, which probably not should have not had my son outside that long. This shoot lasted 5 minutes in both scenes, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to set up creative lighting, be out there myself, and get that perfect shot. It was more focused on composition, exposure, getting him dialed in. So for some creative effects, I'm hoping that you learned something, and definitely reach out if you guys have any further effects and things like that, and stay tuned for next month's article.